before the kingdoms of men were drawn on maps, before iron was pulled from the deep earth and shaped into crowns, there were wolves. Not the small, broken things that skulk along the tree lines today, but great, ancient creatures who wore the moonlight on their backs like armor, whose howls could shake frost loose from the mountains, whose bond marks glowed silver under a full sky. Their world had laws, deep laws, laws carved not in stone, but in the very blood running through every wolf's veins. And at the center of all those laws stood one truth above all others. A king's mate was chosen by the moon goddess herself, not by the council, not by blood rank, not by a name carried in a scroll, by the thunder bond, a soul connection so rare, so consuming, so absolute, that it could not be faked, could not be avoided, and could not be ignored. But this is the story of the night that bond struck, between the most powerful Alpha King in 3 centuries and a girl sleeping inside the hollow of a dying tree. This is marked by midnight. Chapter 1. Hunger was no longer a feeling. It had become a companion, a quiet, patient thing that sat beside Alicia in the dark, pressed its cold shoulder against hers, and breathed with her through the long, frozen nights of Lycaonia. She lay curled in the hollow of a great, ancient oak at the edge of the frostwood, her back pressed against bark that smelled of rot and moss, her knees pulled to her chest, her thin wool wrap doing almost nothing against the bite in the air. She had learned to sleep in small pieces, the way animals do when they are hunted. An hour here, 40 minutes there. Never long enough to sink into real rest. Never safe enough to let her guard fully down. Outside her hollow, the forest breathed. Lycaonia was not a kind territory. It never had been. The mountains rose in the north, like the ridged spine of some sleeping giant, and between the peaks, the winds came down cold and knife-edged, carrying the scent of ice and pine, and something older, something that smelled like power, like dominion, like the deep mineral memory of ancient wolves who had first claimed this land centuries ago. Alicia had no pack. She had not had one in years. She had been 8 years old when they came. She had been climbing the old elm behind the Cole family den, reaching for a bird's nest she had been watching for days when the screaming started below. She remembered the smell of smoke, the sound of her mother's voice cutting off mid-sentence, or the weight of the elm branch under her small hands as she clung there, frozen, while the wolves of another faction tore through her world in the space of a single hour. By the time the silence came, there was nothing left to go back to. She had been running ever since. Not actively, not in the desperate way of the newly hunted, but in the slow, grinding way of someone who had simply accepted that stillness was a luxury she could not afford. She called herself a root dweller, not because anyone had given her the title, but because it was true. She lived beneath roots, between roots, inside the hollow bodies of trees old enough to have seen 3 generations of alphas come and go. She ate what the forest offered, cold berries, the mushrooms that grew in rings near the stream beds, the scraps she found near the edges of territories she was careful never to cross fully into. She had her wolf, a small, silver-pelted creature that stirred inside her chest when the moon rose, pressing against her ribs with a restless, aching energy. But she had never shifted freely, never howled with a pack, never felt the deep, rooted joy of running in formation with her kin. She was 17 when she truly understood that she might die out here, alone. She was 22 when she stopped being afraid of it, and she was 23 years old on the night the ground began to tremble. She felt it first in her feet. Even curled inside the tree hollow with her eyes half closed, she felt the vibration move through the roots beneath her, a deep, rhythmic pulse that her wolf recognized before her conscious mind did. Her eyes opened, Her body went still with the particular sharpness of prey who has heard something that doesn't belong. The trembling was not the earth. It was paws. Many paws, and large. Moving in unison, in the disciplined, ground-eating rhythm of trained wolves who had been running together since before they could walk. A royal guard moved like that. Not frantic, not scattered, but like a tide. Inevitable. Absolute. Alicia pressed deeper into her hollow. Every bone in her body said, "Do not move." The royal guard of the Alpha King didn't come to the Frostwood for the trees. They came on seasonal hunts, great sweeping movements across the territory that were as much a declaration of sovereignty as they were an actual chase. The king made the mountains bow once every cycle, reminding every wolf in Lycaonia who held the high ground. She had hidden from them twice before. She would hide now. But then the wind shifted. It came from the northeast, sliding down from the mountain passes, and it brought with it a scent that Alicia had no name for. She had catalogued thousands of scents in her years in the Frostwood. Pine resin and fox musk, the mineral bite of the stream in winter, the sweet decay of fallen leaves, the acrid warning of other wolves marking their lines. She knew them all. This one was different. Sandalwood. Deep and warm, the kind of warmth that made no sense in the middle of a frozen forest. And beneath it, something electric. The clean, sharp brightness of air just before a storm breaks, when the sky holds its breath and every hair on your body lifts. Her wolf stopped pressing against her ribs. She went utterly, absolutely still inside Alicia's chest. Not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of recognition. The way a wolf goes still when she hears her own name spoken for the first time. Alicia pressed her palm flat against the bark of the hollow and told herself to breathe. The pause slowed, stopped, and then, through the thick curtain of falling snow and pine branches, she heard the sound of a shift, that deep, crackling rush of power that accompanied a wolf taking human form. A large one. The sound of it moved through the air like a low note on an instrument too old to have a name. Silence. Then footsteps. A single pair. Moving through the snow with the unhurried certainty of something that did not believe anything in this forest could threaten it. Stopping directly in front of her oak. Alicia held her breath. A hand parted the curtain of low-hanging branches. Not roughly, almost carefully, as though the owner of that hand understood that sudden movement was not what this moment called for. Golden eyes found hers in the dark. Not amber. Not brown. Gold. The deep, unmistakable, dynasty mark gold of the Charles bloodline. The oldest alpha blood in all of Lycaonia. A colour that every wolf in the territory would recognize the way a subject recognizes a crown. The man looking at her was not what she had imagined a king would be. She had imagined ceremony, distance, the cold architectural composure of someone who had been polished by a lifetime of power into something inhuman. Felix Charles was none of those things. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of wolves who had shifted thousands of times, who had poured themselves into the great dark body of their wolf and back out again until the two forms were inseparable, until the power of the beast ran in their human muscles. His face was made of sharp angles and old weather, the kind of face that looked as though it had seen rain and wind and battle and had simply decided to keep going. Dark hair, a jaw that held tension the way stone holds cold, and those eyes, those impossible gold eyes, looking at her with an expression she had never expected from an Alpha King. Not disgust, not dismissal, shock. Pure, undone, profound shock, as though he had come to this hollow expecting nothing and found instead something that rearranged every thought he had ever had about what his life was going to look like. Inside Alicia's chest, her wolf pressed forward again, not with urgency, so not with desperation, but with the slow, inevitable push of something that had been waiting for a very long time. She had heard of the Thunder Bond in old stories, whispered tales, the kind that the elders told around fire circles to young wolves who thought love was a simple thing, the bond that the moon goddess sometimes struck between two souls, a recognition so deep it bypassed every wall, every wound, every accumulated armor of a life lived hard. She had never believed those stories were about real wolves. Then Felix's gloved hand reached slowly into the hollow, and his fingers touched her mud-streaked cheek with the kind of careful deliberateness of someone who cannot stop themselves, and knows it. The warmth that moved through her was not the warmth of touch. It was something older, or something that moved from his skin into her blood and went all the way down, past flesh, past bone, into the part of her that existed before she had a name. She flinched backward. He did not pull away. His eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that looked almost like grief. The grief of a man who had just realized that the next chapter of his life had nothing to do with the plan he had made. "You are half frozen." His voice was low. Not soft, there was nothing soft about it, but controlled, deliberate. The voice of someone who was used to the world doing what he said, and was choosing, right now, to be very careful. Alicia said nothing. Her throat was so tight, she wasn't sure sound was possible. "When did you last eat?" Still nothing. Felix looked at her for a long moment. At the hollow, at the thin wrap, at the blue-tinged cold of her hands, and something moved across his face. Not pity. Pity would have been easier to refuse. This was fury, quiet, controlled, and aimed not at her, but at whatever had put her here. He removed his heavy cloak in a single motion, wolf skin, thick and dark, still holding the warmth of his body, and held it out to her. "I am not going to ask you to trust me," he said. "I am going to tell you that you will die in this hollow before morning if the temperature drops another degree, and I am not able to let that happen." Alicia looked at the cloak, looked at him. Her wolf was pressing so hard against her ribs now that it was a physical ache. She reached out and took it. The royal guard waited at the edge of the tree line. 20 wolves, all in human form, all armed, but all radiating the particular watchful stillness of trained fighters who had been told to stand down and were not entirely sure they agreed with the order. They watched their king walk out of the trees, carrying a girl wrapped in his cloak. A root dweller, unmistakably, thin, dirty, wild-eyed, smelling of bark and cold and the long loneliness of someone who had been alone far too long. And no one said a word. The general, Ronald, stepped forward. He was a wide, weathered man, with a grey-streaked beard, and eyes that held more history than his face let show. He looked at Alicia with an expression that Alicia, had she been less frozen and more observant, might have recognized as something more specific than simple surprise. It looked like recognition, like relief, like the face of a man who has been carrying a secret so long that the sight of the thing the secret was about nearly breaks him open. "My king," Ronald said carefully. "The circle will be watching our return closely." "Then they can watch," Felix said, and kept walking. No one followed that up with an argument. Felix looked down at the bundle in his arms, because, somewhere between the tree line and the guard, he had picked her up entirely, as naturally as if she were something he had always carried, and found her looking back at him. Her eyes were dark brown, not remarkable in their colour, but remarkable in their expression, a watchfulness that was not fear, precisely, but the thing that comes after fear has been lived with so long it becomes wisdom. The eyes of someone who had learned to see everything and trust nothing. He held her gaze and felt, for the first time in 28 years of living, completely certain of something. "You are safe," he said quietly. "I give you my word, as king." Alicia studied him with those watchful eyes for a long moment. And then, because she was exhausted and cold, and her wolf was singing against her ribs with a warmth she had never felt before in her life, she let her head rest against his chest. The mountains of Lycaonia rose around them as the royal guard fell into formation, and the Alpha King carried his true mate toward the stone fortress on the peak, not knowing yet what it would cost him, not knowing yet the weight of the laws he was about to break, not knowing yet that the girl in his arms was the very thing that 3 generations of conspiracy had been designed to keep from him. He only knew one thing clearly, or he was not putting her down. Chapter 2. The fortress of the Alpha Kings had no name that common wolves used. They called it simply the Peak, and the name was enough. It rose from the highest ridge of the Lycaonian mountains, like something grown rather than built, as though the mountain had decided, one ancient day, to fold itself upward into towers and ramparts and walls thick enough to stop a charging wolf dead. The stone was dark grey, almost black in winter, streaked with veins of silver quartz that caught moonlight and threw it back in scattered fragments. Torches burned in iron brackets along every wall, not for ceremony but for function. The peak was cold even in summer, and in winter it was cold enough that the breath of the guards plumed white even inside the lower corridors. Alicia had never been inside a stone building before. She stood in the entrance hall wrapped in Felix's cloak and stared at the ceiling, high, vaulted, supported by pillars carved with the likenesses of great wolves, mid-shift, their bodies caught in that in-between state of pure power, and felt something she had not expected. Not wonder. Something quieter than wonder. She felt the weight of history, the deep, accumulated gravity of a place that had held something important for a very long time. Her wolf felt it too, and pressed forward eagerly, and Alicia had to consciously hold her back. "Not yet," she told her. "Not yet. We do not know if we are welcome here." She was not wrong to be cautious. The circle of elders arrived in the entrance hall before Felix had finished speaking to his guard. They came down the main corridor in a group, and even across the distance, Alicia could feel the cold radiating from them. There were 5 of them. Old all. The kind of old that wolves who carry genuine power wear differently than humans do. They looked ageless rather than ancient, their faces settled into expressions of permanent assessment. At the front walked Edwin Costa. She would learn his name later, but she understood what he was the moment she saw him. Counselor. Power holder. The kind of man who had built his entire world on the specific arrangement of things, rules, hierarchies, bloodlines, and whose entire face had gone rigid at the sight of her. Beside him walked a woman whose beauty was so precise it felt constructed. Jasmine Roy, her dark hair coiled perfectly, her silver-threaded robes immaculate, her eyes moving over Alicia with the slow, deliberate appraisal of someone calculating the exact size of a problem. Edwin spoke first, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had learned to make statements sound like neutral observations. "My king, you have brought something back from the hunt." Felix's gold eyes moved to Edwin with the unhurried calm of a wolf who does not consider himself to be in any danger. "I have brought back a wolf of Lycaonia who was dying in the Frostwood. She will stay in the peak until she has recovered. And when she has recovered, then we will speak of what comes next." Edwin's gaze moved back to Alicia. He studied her the way one studies a document, looking for the clause that can be argued. Then his eyes moved to Felix's neck, where Alicia's scent would be pressed into the cloak, where the proximity of a true mate bond would already be faintly visible to anyone who knew what to look for, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, alarm. Quick, sharp, carefully suppressed alarm. "The laws of the ancient blood," Edwin began, "are known to me," Felix said simply. "I wrote the last revision of them myself." He turned and walked Alicia deeper into the fortress, leaving the council standing in the entrance hall with the cold coming in off the mountain. Jasmine Roy watched them go with perfectly still eyes. The chamber Felix brought her to was on the upper level of the East Tower, and it was larger than any space Alicia had ever occupied in her life. A stone fireplace occupied most of one wall, and a fire was already burning in it. Someone had lit it before their arrival, and the warmth of it hit Alicia like a physical pressure, washing over her and making every cold, contracted muscle in her body simultaneously ache and release. There was a great bed with furs piled on it, a chest of dark wood, narrow windows set deep into the thick stone through which she could see the mountains and the black sky going slowly grey toward dawn. Felix stood in the doorway and looked at her, standing in the middle of the room, still wrapped in his cloak, still wearing the frozen rags beneath it, still carrying herself with the rigid, braced posture of someone who was not sure if the next moment was going to require her to run. Something in his face shifted. Not toward softness exactly, but toward a kind of careful deliberateness that was its own form of gentleness. "There are fresh clothes in the chest," he said, "but I'm going to have water heated for the bath." Alicia glanced at the stone tub set into an alcove near the fire. It was wide and deep, carved from a single piece of mountain granite, and the thought of hot water was so overwhelming she had to look away from it. "I do not need," she started. "You are covered in 3 days of frost," Felix said, without any heat in it, just a simple statement. "Possibly more. You need the bath, and you need food, and you need sleep. In that order." He left before she could argue further, and returned a short while later, carrying a heavy iron kettle himself rather than sending a servant, a detail that Alicia noticed and filed away, uncertain what to do with it. She did not speak while he poured the heated water into the tub, mixing it with cold from a stone pitcher until the temperature was right, and then dropped in handfuls of herbs from a leather pouch, mountain lavender and frost cedar, the scent rising through the steam in something that made her wolf go still with a bone-deep contentment. When Felix turned to face her, his expression was careful. "I will leave you to it," he said. And then, before he turned, "What is your name?" A pause. She had not said her name aloud to anyone in so long that it felt strange in her mouth. "Alicia," she said. He held that for a moment, and she watched something happen in his eyes, the way a key turns in a lock that has been waiting a long time to open. "Felix," he said in return, as though they were two equal strangers meeting on a road, as though there were no crown between them, no laws, no history. He left her to her bath. She sank into the water and felt 3 yaws of the forest leave her body. Her wolf floated in the warmth, utterly without tension for the first time in memory, and Alicia pressed her back against the stone and stared at the ceiling and let herself think about what was happening. She had heard of the Thunder Bond. She had dismissed it as a story, but she had not imagined a story could produce the feeling that moved through her when his hand touched her face in the hollow. That slow, a seismic certainty, like the moment before a river breaks its banks, when the water is perfectly still and perfectly about to change everything. She did not trust it. Or rather, she trusted the feeling. She did not trust what came after. She had learned, in the hard school of the Frostwood, or that the most dangerous moments were the ones that felt like arrival, because arrival meant letting your guard down, and letting your guard down was how everything ended. She was still working through this when Felix returned with food on a wooden tray, dark bread and roasted root vegetables, and a small clay pot of bone broth that smelled like it had been cooking since yesterday, and set it on the edge of the tub with the casual matter-of-factness of someone who was not going to make anything awkward about this. Alicia pulled the water around herself and watched him settle into the chair near the fire with the posture of a man who had decided he was staying and had made peace with that decision. She reached for the bread. They sat in silence, him at the fire, her in the stone tub, of the mountains black and enormous outside the narrow windows. And the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the particular quiet of two people who have recognized something in each other and are not yet sure what to do with it. Felix looked at the fire and did not look at her, which was its own form of respect. Outside, down in the corridors of the fortress, Edwin Costa moved through the dark with the quiet purpose of a man who had a great deal of work to do before morning, and in the shadows where the torchlight didn't reach, he leaned close to a figure Alicia would not have recognized, and murmured words that were not meant for anyone else's ears. The conspiracy that had begun 15 years ago was waking up again. Chapter 3. 3 days passed. Alicia slept, ate, slept again. Her body pulled her under with the insistent authority of something that had been deprived too long and was now collecting what was owed. 16 hours the first night, 12 the second, a deep and dreamless restoration that left her waking on the third morning with a clarity she barely recognized. She lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and took stock of herself with the methodical habit of someone who had learned to assess their own condition before they did anything else. She was warm. Her muscles had stopped aching. The cold had retreated from her bones. She was, she realized with a small shock, genuinely hungry. Not the dull, constant hunger of slow starvation, but the sharp, purposeful hunger of a body that was working again. She got up, dressed in the clothes from the chest. Dark wool, simple, warm, and nothing like the silk and silver she had glimpsed on Jasmine Roy, and stood at the narrow window and looked out at the mountains. Lycaonia spread below the peak in layers of cold beauty. Dark forest, white peaks, the distant glitter of the river that curved through the valley like a scar of light. She had lived in those forests for years. Looking at them from above was a strange doubling. The same territory, entirely different meaning depending on where you stood within it. A door opened without a knock. Felix stood in the frame, and the moment he was in the room, everything in her body adjusted. That was the only word for it. Adjusted, the way a compass needle swings toward north regardless of where it starts. His gold eyes moved over her quickly, an assessment that was not the cool appraisal of the council, but something more immediate, making sure she was all right, making sure she had slept, eaten, recovered. The impulse to confirm her well-being was clearly coming from somewhere below, conscious thought. She felt that same pull in her own chest and ignored it deliberately. "You look better," he said. "I feel better." She turned back to the window. "You have a strange fortress. It is built as though it grew here." It did, in a way. He came to stand beside her, not close enough to crowd, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him. The first king of this line didn't build the peak. He found it. There were older wolves here before us, older than the current bloodlines, older than the names we use now. He claimed it and built the towers on what was already here. "Old wolves," she said, "like the ones in the carvings. You noticed those." "I notice everything." A pause. She felt him looking at the side of her face. "Yes," he said. "I believe you do." She found the library by accident on the 4th day. She had been exploring the upper corridors with the methodical thoroughness of someone who needed to understand every possible exit from a space before she could be comfortable in it. Not because she planned to run, but because the option mattered. She had rounded a corner and found a door standing open onto a room that seemed to occupy the entire upper floor of the North Tower, floor-to-ceiling shelves of ancient scrolls and leather-bound records, the air thick with the smell of old vellum and cold stone, low tables covered in maps and documents, and the dusty evidence of research that had been ongoing for years. She was standing in front of a tapestry on the far wall when she heard him. The tapestry was old, older than anything else in the room, its threads so fine they had gone almost translucent with age. The image they formed faded to ghost colors. But even faded, she could see it clearly enough. A wolf family, standing before a mountain. Below the image, a family crest, 2 crescent moons facing each other, a single star between them, and beneath that, a name in the old script. Cole. The name landed in her chest like a stone, dropped into still water, sending ripples outward through every part of her. She knew that name. She had known it since she was 8 years old, clinging to an elm branch while the screaming came from below. It was the name she had whispered to herself in the dark on the worst nights in the forest, or the name she had not spoken aloud to anyone because she was afraid of what it might bring. It was her name. "You found the archive room." Felix's voice came from the doorway. She did not turn from the tapestry. Her hand had come up without her meaning it to, fingers hovering near the woven crests, not quite touching. "This family," she said. "Who were they?" Felix was quiet for a moment. She heard him step further into the room. The Coles were one of the founding bloodlines of Lycaonia, one of the oldest lines in the territory. 15 years ago, their den was attacked. Their pack was destroyed. His voice was careful, precise. It was ruled at the time as a rival faction incursion. There were never any survivors confirmed. Alicia's hand finally touched the tapestry. The old threads were soft under her fingertips. "Don, no survivors were confirmed," she said quietly, "because no one was looking hard enough." She heard him stop breathing. She turned then and let him see her face. Let him see the recognition in it, the grief that was never very far from the surface, even after 15 years, and the specific, terrifying vulnerability of someone who has held a secret alone for so long that the act of sharing it is its own kind of free fall. Felix was looking at her with an expression she had no category for. Something between devastation and fury, and beneath both of those, something much quieter. The expression of a man whose world has just reorganized itself around a truth he cannot look away from. He crossed the room in 4 strides and stopped just in front of her, and his hands came up to her face. Both of them, careful and deliberate, or tilting her face toward the light from the narrow window. "Alicia Cole," he said. Not a question. "Alicia Cole," she confirmed, and the name, spoken aloud in this voice, in this room, with his hands on her face, felt like the first honest breath she had taken in 15 years. His gold eyes moved over her face with an intensity that she felt against her skin. His thumbs brushed gently along her jaw, and the warmth of the bond moved between them like a current, slow and deep and inevitable. She wanted to step back. Her feet did not move. "The bloodline survives," he said, almost to himself. And then, more clearly, "You were never nameless. You were never astray. Someone made you disappear." His jaw tightened. "I intend to find out exactly who." His hands dropped from her face. But he did not step back. They were close enough that she could see the specific grain of gold in his eyes, the way his breath came slower and more deliberate when he was trying to hold something in check. She could smell the sandalwood and ozone scent of him clearly from this distance, and her wolf was not pressing against her ribs anymore. Her wolf had gone quiet with a focused, shimmering attention, like a flame in still air. Felix's eyes moved from hers to the line of her throat, to the sensitive cord of muscle along the side of her neck, where a mate mark would eventually go, and the look in them was something between hunger and restraint. His head dipped, just slightly, and his mouth found that cord of her neck with a touch so careful it was barely there. His teeth grazed her skin. Not a bite. A promise, but a question spoken in the language that predates words. Alicia's spine went straight. Every nerve in her body woke up simultaneously, and she felt the bond flare between them like a match touched to old wood. Sudden, bright, wanting more. His mouth lifted from her neck, and he looked at her with eyes that had gone darker than gold. "Not yet," he said, and she understood that he was speaking to himself as much as to her. He stepped back, put distance between them, breathed. "There is a great deal we need to settle first," he said carefully. Her pulse was still loud in her ears. "Yes," she agreed. "There is." They stood in the library with the tapestry of her family's crest behind her, and the weight of everything unresolved between them, and both of them were very deliberately not closing the remaining distance. Outside the library door, to down the corridor, a shadow moved silently away. It had heard enough. Chapter 4. The feast was Edwin's idea. He proposed it to Felix as a gesture of goodwill, a formal welcome for the guest of the Peak, an opportunity for the circle of elders to assess her properly, a chance to demonstrate that the fortress of the Alpha King was a place of ancient hospitality and due process. Felix had said yes, because refusing it outright would have given Edwin ammunition, and Felix was not in the habit of giving his counsel ammunition. Alicia had said nothing when Felix told her, because she understood immediately what the feast was actually for. She had spent 5 years at the edges of territories, watching the way power moved through packs, the false courtesies, the ritual assessments, of the precise social performances that were really excavation. She knew an interrogation dressed in ceremony when she heard one. She dressed carefully. Dark blue wool fitted at the waist, long at the hem, the best of what the chest in her room had offered. She wore her hair loose. It had grown long in the forest, dark waves that fell past her shoulders, and she wore no jewelry, because she had none, and she had decided somewhere between the window and the door that she would not pretend to be something she wasn't. The great hall of the Peak was lit by 1,000 candles set in iron sconces, the long tables covered in dark cloth, the fire pit in the centre burning high and orange. The smell of roasted meat filled the space, and for a moment, standing in the entrance, Alicia's body reacted with a raw, more animal hunger that had nothing to do with the social dynamics of the room. Then she felt Felix's eyes on her from the head of the table, and the hunger shifted its object. He watched her walk the length of the hall with an expression that was very carefully composed to show nothing, but she was learning his face in the involuntary way of someone whose attention keeps returning to the same thing, and she could see beneath the composition something warm, something proprietary in the truest, deepest sense, not possessive in the way of a man who wants to own a thing, but in the way of a wolf who has recognized his own. She sat at the seat to his right. It placed her directly across from Jasmine Roy. The first courses passed in the formal, structured pleasantries of a circle feast, questions about the territory's western borders, but remarks about the coming season's hunt, measured observations about the political weather from the southern wolf clans. Alicia ate slowly and said little, and watched everyone with those quiet, watchful eyes that had kept her alive in the frost wood. Ronald sat 3 seats down. She had noticed him the first night she arrived, and she noticed him again now, the way he kept glancing at her, with that complicated expression she hadn't yet passed. Something between guilt and relief. Something carrying weight. Jasmine Roy broke the pattern partway through the second course. "Tell me, Alicia." Her voice was a beautiful instrument, controlled and precise. "You said you are from Lycaonia. Which bloodline do you claim?" The table quieted. The question was not asked in ignorance. Alicia could see that clearly. But it was asked with the confidence of someone who believes the answer will be none, and who wants it said aloud in front of everyone, so that the claim cannot be made later. Alicia held Jasmine's gaze. The coal line. A beat of silence. The coals, Edwin said smoothly from across the table, were extinguished 15 years ago. There are no surviving members of record. No surviving members were confirmed, Alicia said carefully, using Felix's own phrasing. That is a different thing from there being none. Edwin's smile did not reach his eyes. Indeed. Do you have proof of this claim? I have my blood, Alicia said simply. Felix's hand, resting on the table near hers, moved slightly. Not touching her, but close. A positioning that was not accidental. The second course was served, and Jasmine Roy's posture relaxed by a fraction that Alicia, watching closely, caught and filed away. Alicia reached for her goblet. The wine was dark and rich-smelling, the kind that high-circle wolves drank on formal occasions. She raised it to her lips and stopped. Her nose caught it beneath the wine. A scent, floral and sweet, almost masked by the richness of the wine, but not quite. Moonflower, a plant that grew in the high meadows, harmless in cooking, but concentrated moonflower forced a shift. Fast, painful, uncontrolled. In a wolf who had not shifted freely in years, it could cause serious damage. She set the goblet down without drinking. When she looked up, Jasmine Roy was watching her with bright, still eyes, waiting. Alicia looked back at her steadily. She reached for the water pitcher instead, or poured herself a cup and drank it with the deliberate calm of someone who has decided that they are not going to give anyone in this room the satisfaction of seeing them falter. The calculation in Jasmine's eyes shifted, recalibrated. Edwin said something to the elder on his left in a low voice. Alicia felt Felix's attention on the side of her face, sharp and specific, and knew he had caught the goblet moment. His hand, resting near hers on the table, turned palm up slightly. An offer. She did not take it. Not here, not in front of them. But she felt it, and the feeling of it settled something in her chest. Ronald knocked his own goblet over at that moment, in what was clearly not an accident, sending wine cascading across Edwin's end of the table and redirecting the attention of the room with the focused chaos that only a very deliberate person can create by looking completely clumsy. In the small commotion, Alicia's goblet was cleared away with the rest of the spilled items. She looked at Ronald. He was mopping at the wine with a cloth, not looking at her, but the line of his shoulders held an apology so large she could almost read it. She understood then. He knew. He had always known. The beast came later. She was walking back to her chamber through the upper corridor when it hit. Not from the goblet she hadn't drunk, but from residue. The moonflower had been in the cloth the goblet was resting on, and she had touched the cloth when she moved it, just enough to absorb through her fingers over the course of the meal, but not enough to cause the full forced shift Jasmine had intended, but enough. The wolf came up in her like a tide, not the gentle controlled push she was used to, a violent surge like water through a broken dam, tearing through her in a wave of heat and pressure, and the sound of her own heartbeat, suddenly very loud. She barely made it to the corridor wall before her knees went. And then the wolf emerged, not the small, suppressed thing she had kept contained for years, but the real one, full and silver and enormous for her frame, her pelt the color of moonlight on snow, and she threw her head back, and the sound that came out of her shook the stone. It was not a cry of pain. It was a declaration. Felix was there in moments. She would learn later that he had been following her to make sure she returned safely, that he had already told 2 guards to watch the corridor. He shifted the moment he heard her, his great dark wolf filling the space, coming between her and the direction of the hall, positioning himself with the instinctive, absolute priority of a wolf protecting the most important thing he has. The guards in the corridor fell back without being asked. Ronald arrived third, and he stood at the far end of the hallway and looked at the silver wolf, still trembling, still radiating forced shift heat, but enormous, powerful, whole, and the expression on his face was one that held 15 years of guilt in a single moment. Felix shifted back. He crouched in front of Alicia's wolf, eye level, gold eyes steady. "It is passing," he said quietly. "You are strong enough to come through it. Now stay with me." Her wolf looked at him with silver eyes and made a sound low in her throat. Not distress, not submission. Something much older. Something that said, "You. Just you." Felix's gold eyes went very bright. When she shifted back, he wrapped her in his arms before she had fully finished, and she pressed her face against his chest and breathed, and he held the back of her head with one large hand and breathed with her, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then, "Who did it?" His voice was very quiet. Alicia pulled back far enough to look at him. "I think you already know." His jaw was tight. "I need to hear you say it." "Jasmine Roy, the cloth the goblet was resting on." A pause. "But she does not do anything. Edwin does not approve." Felix looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, pulled her up with him, and kept one hand on her arm, not gripping, just present. "Ronald," he said, without turning. "My king." Ronald's voice was rough. "You have something to tell me." A long, heavy pause. Then the sound of an old soldier squaring himself for the hardest accounting of his life. "Yes," Ronald said. "I do." Chapter 5. Ronald told the story standing in the corridor with the torchlight moving over his weathered face, and the telling of it took the shape of a confession that had been eating him alive for 15 years. He had been a young general when Edwin Costa began his work on the Circle of Elders. Edwin had been ambitious even then, precise, patient, long-visioned in the way of wolves who think in decades rather than seasons. He had identified the Cole bloodline as a problem. The Coles were the only family in Lycaonia whose ancient blood was strong enough to produce a true lunar-blessed mate for the king. If the king bonded with a Cole line wolf, his power would become something the Circle could not manage or balance. Edwin had decided, with the cold calculation of a man who believed in control above all things, that the Cole line needed to end. Ronald had not planned the raid. He had not ordered it. But he had known something was coming, and he had not stopped it. And he had spent 15 years feeding that knowledge with silence, and feeding scraps to the girl in the forest as his only inadequate atonement. He said all of this in the voice of a man who was not asking for forgiveness. He was simply handing the truth over to the people it belonged to. Alicia listened without speaking. Felix listened without moving. When it was done, the corridor held the silence for a long moment. Then Alicia said, "You left food for me?" "Yes." "Every time I thought it was an animal kill I had missed," she said slowly. "Or good luck." "It was me," Ronald said. "Not often enough. Never enough. But I knew what Edwin had done, and I could not undo it. And it was the only thing I could do." His voice cracked briefly. He steadied it. "It was the only thing," Felix said. "Ronald, my king, take everything you have just told me and put it in a formal declaration. Every detail, every name, everything you know." Felix's voice was level. "I will need all of it." Ronald nodded. Something in his posture loosened. Not completely. Not yet. But the way a bow loosens when the string is finally let off after years of being held at draw. He left them in the corridor, and Felix turned to Alicia. He took her to the hidden spring. It was deep inside the mountain, accessible through a passage off the Lower East corridor that was not on any map Alicia had seen in the library, that no one else in the fortress seemed to know about. Felix lit the way with a torch, leading her through a low tunnel that opened suddenly into a wide underground chamber where a natural hot spring filled a basin of smooth black rock, the steam rising in slow spirals, the walls glittering with mineral deposits that caught the torchlight and scattered it in amber and gold. The sound of the water was the only sound. Alicia stood at the edge of the spring and breathed in the heat, mineral and ancient, of the smell of the deep mountain, the smell of something that had been here far longer than any king, and felt the last of the moonflower tremors leave her body. Felix sat on the flat stone ledge above the water and looked at his hands. She recognized this as him working something through, the particular stillness of someone whose mind is moving very fast while his body holds very still. "Edwin orchestrated the death of your family," he said, "to keep you from me, to keep the bloodlines from combining." She sat across from him, drawing her knees up. "He is afraid of what we would be together." Felix looked at her across the steam. "What we would be together." He said it slowly, testing the shape of it. "Are you afraid of it?" A long pause. "I am afraid of wanting something," she said quietly. "I have not let myself want anything in years. Not because the wanting is wrong, but because—" She stopped, started again. "When you have lost everything, the things you want become the things that hurt you most." Felix was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am afraid that you will look at what I am asking you to step into, the circle, the laws, the politics, the danger, and decide that the hollow in the tree was safer." "It was safer," she said honestly. "I know. But safe is not the same as alive." She looked at the water. "I have been safe for 15 years. I have been surviving. I have not been—" She paused. "Living," he offered. "Yes." The steam moved between them in slow curls. Felix left the ledge and came to sit beside her, and the warmth of him along her side was different from the warmth of the spring, specific, directed, the warmth of a living thing that had decided it was staying. His hand found hers on the stone. He turned her palm upward and traced the lines in it with his thumb, very slowly, as though he were reading something written there. "I need to tell you something about the Thunder Bond," he said. "Tell me." "It does not compel. I want to be clear about that. The stories make it sound like a force that overrides everything, that wolves bonded by it have no choice. That is not true." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "It is recognition. The moon goddess shows you your equal, the one who is meant to walk beside you, whose soul complements yours at the deepest level. But what you do with that recognition is still a choice." He looked at her. "I am choosing. I want you to know that. Not because the bond demands it. Because I am standing here with all the information I have, and I am choosing this." Alicia looked at the place where his thumb was moving across her hand. She thought about the hollow in the tree, about the cold, about the long, patient silence of 15 years of surviving alone. She thought about the way his hands had held her face in the library, the way his teeth had grazed her neck with the careful promise of something not yet given. She looked up at him. "I am choosing too," she said. "I want you to know that it is terrifying. I know. And I am choosing anyway." Something in his face came undone. He drew her toward him slowly, giving her every chance to pause, to reconsider, to redirect. And she didn't. She moved into him with the same inevitability she had been moving toward him since the hollow in the tree. And when his mouth found hers, it was not the careful, restrained touch she had been expecting. It was hunger. Deep, honest, long-denied hunger, and hers rose to meet it with a fire she hadn't known she was carrying. His hands were in her hair, and her hands were pressed against the warmth of his chest, and the bond between them sang like a struck chord, resonant, deep, filling the underground chamber with something that had no sound but could be felt in the chest, in the bones, in the old animal part of the soul that existed before words. He pulled back enough to breathe, pressing his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Alicia Cole," he said softly. "Felix," she answered. He kissed her again, slower this time, learning the shape of her, and she let herself be learned, and gave the same attention back in equal measure, her hands moving up from his chest to his jaw, and the warmth of the spring around them and the warmth between them were one continuous thing. They stayed in the hidden spring for a long time. When they finally emerged into the mountain corridor, walking close together through the torchlit dark, they were not king and vagrant anymore. They were not alpha and root dweller. They were something that had a name in the old language, a name written into the moon, goddess's own laws, before any elder had ever drawn up a rule about bloodlines and purity, and what was and wasn't permitted. They were bonded, and they were ready for what was coming. Chapter 6. Edwin moved quickly once he understood that Ronald had spoken. He called the circle to formal session the following morning. All 5 elders gathered in the judgment chamber at the base of the East Tower, seated on the carved stone chairs that had held every circle in the history of Lycaonia, and he opened the session before Felix had arrived by making his position clear. The Alpha King could not mate with a wolf of unverified status. The laws of the ancient blood were not suggestions. They were the architecture of everything the Lycaonian throne stood upon, and if Felix was permitted to break them for personal reasons, however sympathetic, however dramatic the circumstances, then the entire structure of authority that held the territory together would begin to collapse. He made this argument carefully and at length, and by the time Felix walked into the chamber, 3 of the 5 elders had already been moved toward Edwin's position with the efficient precision of a man who had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this conversation. Alicia entered behind Felix. The circle looked at her. She looked back at them. Edwin stood. He was taller than she remembered from the feast, or perhaps it was the chamber that made him seem so. The judgment room had the specific gravity of a place where many hard decisions had been made, and it pressed down on everything in it. "My king," Edwin said, "the circle of elders calls for the trial of the silver flame." Felix stopped walking. The trial of the silver flame was old, older than the current circle, older than Felix's bloodline, older than most of the laws that Edwin invoked to run his arguments. It was a fire that burned without ordinary fuel, sustained by a rite performed only during the lunar convergence, a single night each cycle when the full moon and its reflection in the mountain lake aligned perfectly. The flame burned silver, and the law was absolute. Only a wolf of true and uncorrupted bloodline could pass through it unharmed. Anyone whose heritage was false, whose claim was fabricated, would be marked by the flame. It had not been called in 3 generations. "The trial," Edwin continued smoothly, "will confirm the validity of the Cole claim. If Alicia's blood is what she says it is, the flame will show it. If it is not, and if the trial is called falsely," Felix said. His voice had gone very quiet, which Alicia had learned to recognize as the sound of him at maximum restraint. "If the circle uses the flame not to verify a true claim, but to attempt to destroy one? That is not the intent. The intent." Felix moved to the center of the chamber and looked at Edwin with those gold eyes that had seen everything. "Edwin, you have been managing this territory's bloodlines for 20 years. You managed them 15 years ago when the coal den burned. You will stand before this circle and tell me the intent is verification?" A silence fell that had sharp edges. Edwin met his king's gaze. "The laws exist for a reason. If you set them aside for personal sentiment, you have no laws. Only preferences." Felix was quiet for a moment. Then, "Call the trial." Every head in the room turned toward him. "My king," Alicia began. "Call it," Felix said, still looking at Edwin. "We will stand before the silver flame at the lunar convergence, and we will let the moon goddess decide." He paused. "And Edwin? When the flame turns, we will be having a very different conversation about what you have done in the name of these laws." Edwin's expression held for a long moment. Then it shifted, very slightly, but Alicia caught it, into something that was not quite certainty anymore. 3 days until the lunar convergence. 3 days of the fortress holding its breath. The circle moved through the corridors with the wound-tight energy of a group of people who had committed to a course of action and were now watching for any indication that it had been a mistake. Guards were repositioned. The circle met in closed session twice. Jasmine Roy spent most of the 3 days in Edwin's study, and the sound of their voices, low and urgent, leaked under the door at all hours. Alicia spent those 3 days in the library. She went through every scroll about the Cole bloodline she could find. There was more than she expected. The Coles had been significant, genuinely so, their history threaded through the territory's records in a dozen places. They had been scholars, warriors, pack builders. One Cole, 3 generations back, had stood beside the founding king and helped draft the original laws that Edwin was now using as weapons. She found, in an inner scroll protected in a cedar case, a reference to the lunar blessing. It was a counter to the lunar curse, the story Edwin had apparently been spreading about her mark. The dark ring that had appeared on her wrist after years of unshifted wandering, which he had told the circle was a sign of corruption, but of a wolf gone spiritually feral. The scroll said something different. It said that the mark appeared in wolves of strong bloodline who had been separated from their pack under circumstances of injustice. It was not a curse. It was a dormant power, waiting for the moment of restoration. She sat with that scroll in her hands for a long time. Then she went to find Felix. He was in the weapons room. Not training, just maintaining his blades with the methodical attention of someone who needed to do something with his hands. He looked up when she came in and put the blade down immediately. She showed him the scroll. He read it twice. Then he looked at the mark on her wrist. The dark ring she had kept covered since arriving at the peak, more self-conscious about it in a way she hadn't examined closely, and his thumb moved across it with the same deliberate attention he had given to her palm in the hidden spring. "You are not cursed," he said. "I know." "But will the circle believe a scroll over Edwin's testimony?" Felix looked at her steadily. "They will not need to. The silver flame will show them. You have a great deal of faith in the flame." "I have faith in what you are." His voice was direct and certain, and entirely without performance. "And I will not let you walk into that fire alone. Felix, I am telling you now, so you are not surprised when it happens." He picked the blade back up, turned it over once, set it down again. "When you walk into the silver flame, I will be beside you. That is not a negotiation." Alicia looked at him for a long moment. "For you would defy the laws," she said. "The laws say the king must not mate with a nameless wolf," he said. "You have a name. The laws say the trial must be stood alone. There is no law that says the king cannot stand at his mate's side." He met her eyes. "I have read every version of the ancient blood that exists in this library. Edwin is counting on emotional paralysis and legal ambiguity. I have been closing his arguments for 3 days." She felt something shift in her chest, something that had been braced for 15 years, slowly releasing. "You are very thorough," she said. "I am very motivated," he replied. The night of the lunar convergence arrived on a clear sky and a full moon that looked larger than any Alicia had ever seen from the forest floor. The mountain air was still and cold and electric with something she recognized, but after everything, as the particular atmosphere of moments that the universe has been building toward for a long time. The ceremony ground was on the highest plateau of the peak, open to the sky, ringed by standing stones carved with the old script. The circle stood in formal array. The wolves of the guard were present, and others, those who lived in the fortress, those who had travelled from the lower territory when word of the trial reached them. Because word of a Silver Flame trial travels fast among wolves who understand what it means. Edwin stood before the great stone basin at the centre of the plateau. He spoke the words of ignition in the old tongue, and the silver flame rose, clean and cold and brilliant, burning silver-white with a light that had nothing of ordinary fire in it. It was beautiful in the way that very old, and very powerful things are beautiful. It was also genuinely dangerous, and everyone present knew it. Alicia stood at the edge of the flame's warmth and looked into it. Her wolf looked back at her from inside her own chest, silver eyes in silver light, and she felt absolutely calm. "Alicia," Jasmine Roy's voice, from just behind her. Alicia turned. Jasmine was looking at the flame, not at her. Something in her expression had shifted. The constructed composure slightly cracked, a look of calculation that had a thread of doubt running through it. "You should step back," Jasmine said quietly. "Walk away. Edwin will let you leave the peak alive if you go now. You cannot win this." Alicia looked at her. "You were the one who poisoned my goblet." A silence. "I was following instructions." "I know." Alicia held Jasmine's gaze. "Go stand with Edwin. You are going to want to watch what happens next." She turned back to the flame. Felix was beside her before she took the first step, exactly as he had said he would be. Not grabbing her arm, not pulling her back, but standing at her shoulder with his shoulder touching hers, looking into the same fire. Edwin's voice cracked across the plateau. The trial must be stood alone. "Find me the statute," Felix said, without turning from the flame. "Find me the exact passage. I have read every version. It does not exist." A long silence from Edwin's direction. Felix looked at Alicia. The moonlight was extraordinary on his face. Gold eyes lit from above by the full moon and from below by the silver flame, and the expression in them was the simplest thing she had ever seen on a human face. Not calculation, not strategy, love. Pure, ancient, staked everything love. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said. They stepped into the silver flame together. The cold hit first, not heat, as she had expected, but a deep, searching cold. The cold of something that moved through flesh and went directly to origin. She felt it move through her skin, through her blood, into the bone-deep architecture of her heritage, reading her the way old magic reads what is true. It found the Cole bloodline. It found the lunar blessing on her wrist. And then it went further. It found the bond between her and Felix, the thunder bond, the moon goddess's own signature written into the space between two souls. And that was when the silver turned. It didn't happen gradually. It happened in a single breath. The silver flame went gold. Not orange, not yellow. The deep was extraordinary gold of the Charles dynasty's eyes, of the founding mark, of the moon goddess's highest recognition. Gold fire swept from the basin outward, touching every standing stone, climbing the carved script on the ancient monuments, and for one impossible moment, the entire plateau was lit in gold so bright that every wolf present turned their faces up toward it involuntarily, every single one, as though something in their oldest instincts recognized what they were looking at. The moon goddess's verdict. Unambiguous. Absolute. Beyond any law that any elder had ever written. Alicia stood in the middle of it, and felt the lunar blessing open in her blood like a flower, felt the dormant power that had been waiting in the dark of the mark on her wrist release. or felt it move through her in a wave of warmth that was nothing like the cold of the searching flame. It was the warmth of belonging, the warmth of being seen, fully and truly, and found whole. Felix's hand found hers in the middle of the gold fire. She held on. When the flame returned to silver, and they stepped back from the basin, the plateau was completely silent. Every elder was still. Every guard was still. Every wolf who had travelled from the lower territory to witness this stood without moving, looking at the two wolves who had stepped into a trial that was supposed to destroy one of them and come out burning gold. Edwin Costa stood at the edge of the circle of elders, and the composure that had never cracked in 20 years of political manoeuvring had finally given way. He looked like a man who had played the longest game of his life and lost. Not in a close finish, but in a rout. Lost not because he had miscalculated, but because the force he had been working against was simply larger than anything he could calculate against. He looked, for the first time, afraid. Felix turned from the fire to face him. "Edwin Costa," he said, and his voice filled the plateau the way the gold fire had filled it. Not loud, but everywhere. Not forced, but inevitable. "In the name of the ancient blood, in the light of the moon goddess's judgment, and before every witness present on this ground tonight, I am removing you from the circle of elders. You will be taken to the Eastern Hold until your formal trial can be convened. And every word of what you have done to this bloodline, to this territory, to the laws you used as instruments of your own fear, every word will be spoken before the full circle and recorded in the history of this peak." Edwin said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Chapter 7. The days that followed moved with the particular momentum of things that have been held back for a long time. Edwin was escorted to the Eastern Hold before dawn. He went without resistance, the specific, closed-down quiet of a man who has accepted the shape of his defeat and is calculating his remaining options, which were fewer than he would have liked. Ronald's formal declaration was submitted to the circle the following morning, and 2 of the 3 elders who had sided with Edwin the previous day withdrew their support within hours of reading it. The 3rd spent a day in silence, and then came to Felix personally to offer his account of everything he had witnessed over 20 years of Edwin's management. Jasmine Roy was stripped of her circle title by formal session on the 2nd day. She accepted this with the cool dignity of someone who had known this moment was possible and had decided in advance how she would meet it. She left the peak on the 3rd day with a small escort and her personal belongings, and no title, moving toward the southern territories where her family's original den was situated. Alicia watched her go from the window of the East Tower. She did not feel triumph. She felt something more complicated, the specific gravity of events that have cost people things they cannot get back. Jasmine was not a good person. She had done real harm. But she was also a wolf who had spent her life in the gravity of Edwin's ambitions, shaped by a man who used everyone around him as instruments, and there was something in watching her walk away that felt like the end of a very long story that should never have been told. She was still at the window when Felix came to stand beside her. "She's gone," Alicia said. "Yes." "What happens to Edwin?" "The formal trial will determine his exile. He will not return to this territory." He looked at the same view she was looking at. He spent 20 years shaping this kingdom toward what he wanted it to be. It is going to take time to find everything he touched and straighten it. "Is that work you want to do alone?" He turned from the window to look at her. "No," he said simply. "It is not." Ronald found Alicia in the library on the 5th day. He came without announcement, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. A large, weathered man, holding his own weight with the posture of someone still in the process of setting down a heavy thing they have been carrying too long. "Alicia," he said. She looked up from the scroll she was reading. He came into the room and sat across from her at the low table, and he looked at his hands for a moment before he looked at her. "I cannot give back what was taken from you," he said. "I have made my peace with carrying that. But I want you to know." He stopped. "Rebuilt. Your family were good wolves. Your mother was one of the finest wolves I knew, in the time when I knew her. She deserved better than what happened to her, and so did you, and I am sorry that the only thing I could find the courage to do was leave scraps at the edge of a forest." Alicia was quiet for a moment. "The scraps kept me alive," she said. "On 2 occasions specifically, they were the difference." She held his gaze. "I am not able to tell you that it is enough. But I am not going to let it keep being the shape of what is between us." Something in Ronald's face shifted. Not relief, exactly, but the release of something that had been held very tight. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "Then, I am going to need people who know this territory. People who remember how things worked before Edwin spent 20 years rewriting them." She paused. "Would you be willing to help me learn it?" Ronald looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened slightly, and the guilt in his posture reorganized itself into something that looked more like purpose. "Yes," he said. "I would." The mate bond ceremony was scheduled for the night of the next full moon. Alicia had read about it in the old records, the ancient rite that predated every ceremony the Circle of Elders had layered on top of it, the ceremony in its original form. A full moon, an open sky, the king and his chosen mate standing before their pack, and the moon goddess, and the mark. The mark was the center of it. Not a ring, not a crown, not a document signed in ink. A bite. The alpha's teeth sinking into the cord of his mate's neck, leaving a permanent mark that would glow faintly silver under moonlight for the rest of their lives, binding their life forces together in the deep, irreversible way of true bonds. What and hers on him? The same mark on the same place, given in return, because a bond was not a claim in one direction, but a mutual anchoring. Every wolf in the territory who could travel to the peak was there. Alicia stood in the chamber where she had slept her first night at the fortress, and let the women who served the king dress her for the ceremony. Not silk and silver, not the constructed finery of circle politics. She had been clear about what she wanted. She wore deep blue wool, the color she had chosen herself on the first morning, fitted and clean, with the Cole family crest embroidered in silver thread along the collar by a craftsman who had spent 3 days on it. Her hair was unbound. She wore no crown. She looked at herself in the polished metal of the mirror and did not recognize the girl who had lived in the hollow of an oak tree. She recognized the woman looking back at her. The plateau was lit by the full moon and by 1,000 torches set into the standing stones, and the wolves of Lycaonia filled every space that wasn't taken by the ancient carved monuments, standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold mountain air, with their faces turned toward the ceremony ground. Felix stood at the center in the dark, formal wear of the ancient ceremony, no crown, as was traditional, because the king brought only himself to a bonding, no symbols, no regalia, just his blood and his word. And when Alicia came through the passage and onto the plateau, and the wolves parted to make way for her, why, he watched her walk toward him, with the expression of a man who has been given back something he didn't know he'd lost. Ronald stood to Felix's left. The 2 remaining elders who had earned their place stood to the right. The rest of the plateau was a living sea of wolves, silent and witnessing, and above them all the full moon was enormous and silver-white, and present in a way that felt less like weather and more like attention. Alicia stopped in front of Felix. He looked at her. She looked at him. The elder on the right spoke the old words. The words that had started every bonding ceremony since the first king had stood on this plateau under the first full moon with the woman the moon goddess had chosen for him. The words were in the old tongue, and they said, translated, and something like, "Under the eye of the moon and the witness of the pack, what is spoken here is written in blood and cannot be unwritten." Felix took her hands in both of his. "Alicia Cole," he said, "you are the last of a line that this territory wronged. You survived what was designed to end you. You came back to this ground not as a ghost or a ghost's echo, but as yourself, whole, real, named." His hands tightened around hers. "I am asking you, before every wolf on this plateau and the moon above them, to stand beside me. Not behind me, not in my shadow, beside me. As my equal, my mate, my lunar queen." She held his eyes and felt absolutely steady. "Felix Charles," she said, "you found me in a hollow in a dying tree, and you looked at me like I was the answer to a question you had been asking your whole life, but you brought me home before you knew my name. You stood in a fire with me when you did not have to." She felt the bond between them warm and deep and utterly solid. "I am choosing you. The kingdom, the laws, the fight that is still coming, all of it. Because you are worth fighting for." The elder spoke the final words of permission, and Felix raised his hands to cup her face, and his forehead pressed against hers for a moment. The quiet before the seal, the last breath of a life that was about to become permanently, wonderfully other than it had been. Then his mouth found the cord of her neck, and his teeth pressed into her skin with the focused, deliberate intention of a mark being placed, not violently, not roughly, but with the particular care of someone making a promise they intend to keep for the rest of their life. Of the mark bloomed beneath his teeth, and the bond between them, which had been building since the hollow in the tree, since the golden eyes in the dark and the touch of his gloved hand on her mud-streaked face, completed. It was not a small thing. It was vast and quiet, and moved through her like the turning of something enormous, like the season changing, like a river reaching the sea. She felt him in her blood. She turned, and her hands rose to his neck, and her own teeth found the same place on the same cord, and she gave back what she had received, her mark, her claim, her answer, and she felt his whole body shift with the completion of it, felt the bond lock closed on his side, felt the deep, animal ancient satisfaction of a wolf who has finally come home. When they separated, both of them were breathing hard. His eyes, looking at her, were the most gold she had ever seen them. The mark on her neck was already glowing faintly silver in the moonlight, and then every wolf on the plateau threw their head back at the same moment, not organized, not choreographed, just the spontaneous, irresistible response of hundreds of wolves feeling a bond complete in their territory. And the howl went up into the cold mountain sky like a wave of sound, enormous and ancient, and full of the specific joy of a kingdom that has been set right. Later, much later, when the ceremony had given way to the gathering of wolves celebrating through the night, when the torches were burning low and the moon had moved across a quarter of the sky, Alicia stood on the balcony of the East Tower and looked out over Lycaonia. The territory spread in all directions, the dark forest and white peaks, and the distant silver thread of the river, and above it the sky was enormous and absolutely clear, every star visible, the full moon pouring light across everything in a way that made the whole landscape look like something remembered rather than something seen. She had slept inside that landscape for years, inside its cold and its dark and its beautiful, indifferent wildness. She had thought it was all she had. Felix came from the chamber and stood behind her, his arms coming around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, both of them looking out at the same view. He was warm and solid, and she could feel the bond between them like a fourth presence. Not heavy, not demanding. Just there. Constant. Rooted. "What are you thinking?" he said quietly, near her ear. She was quiet for a moment. "I am thinking that I lived in this territory for 15 years as a ghost," she said, "and now I am standing on the highest point in it, and it looks exactly the same, and everything is different." His arms tightened slightly around her. "Is that good?" "It is the best thing I have ever felt." He pressed his lips to the side of her head and said nothing, because nothing was necessary. Below them, the wolves of Lycaonia were still celebrating, their voices and their howls rising through the cold air in something that sounded like joy, the territory full of it, the mountains full of it, the long night full of it. The Alpha King's hands rested over his lunar queens, both of them standing at the edge of a kingdom that had spent 20 years being managed toward darkness and was now, slowly, turning back toward the light. What they had work to do. Real work. The long, difficult, careful work of rebuilding what Edwin had bent, of setting right what he had twisted, of growing into a kind of leadership that the territory had not seen in a generation. It would not be easy. The road from here was long, and would have hard days in it, days of doubt and resistance, and the particular exhaustion of fighting for what is right against people who have invested in things being wrong. But for now, this, the mountain, the moon, the bond, new and complete and permanent, glowing silver on both their necks, for now this was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And so the moon goddess's work was done. Not cleanly. Nothing that matters is ever done cleanly. Edwin Costa's trial would stretch for months, and the unraveling of what he had built would take years, and there would be elders who resisted the new order, and packs in the Southern Territory who tested the new queen's patience and her resolve. But Alicia Cole, who had once fit the entire perimeter of her world inside the hollow of a dying oak, was not easily tested. She had been shaped by something that made her difficult to break. 15 years of surviving alone, of keeping her wolf alive inside her, when every pressure was toward giving up, of holding a name and a bloodline in her chest like a secret ember, when the whole world was telling her she was nothing. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She had been waiting. And Felix Charles, the king whose golden eyes had found her in the dark of the frost wood, who had wrapped her in his cloak before he even knew her name, understood, and from the first moment the Thunderbond struck, that he had not found something small. He had found the missing piece of everything. The moon goddess, as it turns out, does not make mistakes. She only makes plans that take longer than expected to unfold. This has been marked by midnight. If this story moved something in you, if you felt the Thunderbond strike, if you felt the gold fire rise, then you are already part of the pack. Like, subscribe and tell us in the comments, is love worth losing a kingdom? And do you believe the moon goddess ever makes a mistake? We will see you in the next chapter of the night.